Let's start with the Calgary Flames in the West. So 91 points, currently sitting 4 points back of the Winnipeg Jets, who clinched a playoff spot, of course. 17 overtime and shootout losses, the most in the NHL for the Calgary Flames, although they did go on a nice little run towards the end, 6-2-2 in their last 10 games. Brad Treliving, you got to give him a lot of credit. Don't know if he's going to be back as the general manager next season. His contract is expiring at the end of the season here. He doesn't have an extension in place right now. He did make a nice effort to improve this hockey team and pivot after losing two huge parts of this team last offseason. We've talked about it a lot with the losses of Matthew Tkachuk and Johnny Gaudreau. This team had expectations, and it just flat out was not good enough. I think luck has a lot to do with it, a very unlucky team, but man, it just wasn't good enough. A disappointing season for the Calgary Flames. Your thoughts?
Yeah, disappointing to say the least, and I'm glad you mentioned luck because that's something that I wanted to touch on when talking about this team. But right off the bat, like you mentioned, 17 overtime and shootout losses, that's ridiculous, like unheard of. I can't believe that they've lost that many games in extra time. It's just crazy. So right there, I mean, that signals to you that this team can be better. They're just losing a bunch of one-goal games, and a lot of that has come down to goaltending and not being able to get a goal when you need one. But I'm not overly worried about Calgary heading into next season. Like you mentioned, a lot of things changed. Obviously, they brought in Huberdeau. He didn't live up to expectations this season, and Weegar as well. You know, I think a lot of that, though, has to do with these two players fitting into a brand new system with all new teammates on a team that, frankly, isn't coached very well by Daryl Sutter. So when mentioning, you know, Brad Treliving and whether or not he'll be back, to me, the bigger question is whether or not Sutter will be back. Yeah. I know that Treliving doesn't have a contract, but I think the real problem for this team is coaching. So I just had to get that out there. In terms of offense, though, like the big problem for this team, obviously after losing those two weapons, is the fact that they didn't have any one singular player to replace that scoring that they lost in Gaudreau and Tkachuk. Tyler Toffoli led the team this year in points. And then guys like Lindholm, Kadri, and Backlund are all arguably more impactful offensively than Huberdeau's been this season, which just can't happen when you trade or when you sign a guy like Huberdeau like they did in that massive trade. So, you know, just disappointing there. I will say they did get massive growth from guys like Dylan Dubé and Anderson as well, both offensively and defensively. I think Mangiapane might have taken a step back, but you know, overall the depth is kind of there. A guy like Blake Coleman is having a decent year as well. But in terms of luck, like it's just been an abysmal season for this team. And I remember, you know, maybe a month ago now or so, you sent me a post, and it was basically like all of the luck stats that were going against Calgary this season. Most games decided by one goal, most losses by one goal, most overtime and shootout losses, most posts hit, fewest third period comebacks, most losses when out shooting opponents by 10 plus shots, and that was an NHL record that they set this year. So just a lot of things not going their way. I'll add to that as well, they're currently 7th in expected goals for in the NHL, but not there in terms of actual goals for, so they're scoring below expected. And then when it comes to goaltending as well, both their guys haven't been good enough. Vladar last year wasn't good at all, and this year he's been even worse. But Markstrom last year was ranked, around top 10 in the league in terms of goals saved above expected. I believe he finished 12th. This year, I looked it up, is currently sitting in 76th. So a lot of things not going right for Calgary, but if I'm going to do this for all three teams and sort of give a diagnosis and what we see them doing next, I would say, you know, the diagnosis for this team is they were just very unlucky. And for next steps, I would just say stay the course, maybe add a piece or two, but let these guys fit into this system and maybe get a new coach and go from there. But generally not too worried about Calgary. It's just tough that one Canadian team isn't making the playoffs, and it's only by a few points.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, and I agree with all of that. I think the big thing here is coaching. I just think that there have been a lot of reports out there that sort of the Daryl Sutter Act has kind of it's weared really thin on the players, and he's an old school guy. He is a hell of a coach. We know that he's been very successful in this league. He won the Jack Adams for best coach in the league last season, but I just think that old school mentality, I think it really was wearing thin with players in that locker room this season, and was just a really, really tough year, I think, going into it with all of the changes and everything. So I really do think that this team would benefit from a coaching change. And, I mentioned that Brad Treliving, the general manager, doesn't have a contract extension yet. I would think that, and I would agree with you, that it's more likely that Treliving is back rather than Daryl Sutter, who did get a contract extension, by the way, from Brad Treliving, which is interesting. But I think that, the coach is more likely to be gone than the general manager. And for the Calgary Flames, we've seen this before. We've heard Brad Treliving say before that this is a good hockey team. They just underachieved. And so I think there's that, and also the fact that they were really unlucky. So I think that this team will be back next year. And in terms of what's next, also, I think they have to give more opportunities to the younger players coming up. We saw a player like Walker Dewar really come into his own down the stretch. Jacob Peltier, Dustin Wolf, who's only lost 9 regulation games in the American Hockey League this season. He just looks like a potential franchise goaltender for this team, which is really encouraging given the fact that Markstrom and Vladar had such tough seasons between the pipes for this team. You've got Matt Coronado, who just signed out of the NCAA as well. So they've got guys coming, and they've got guys right now. I think they're a good team, but they just need to be better utilized and play a better system, and they'll be right back in the playoffs next season.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just to round out the conversation on Calgary, I think the main point that I wanted to stress was their goaltending hasn't been very good, and you mentioned that as well. Next season, with Dustin Wolf coming in, I think that gives you a legitimate third option to push the other two to perform. And maybe he could even take over a backup spot from Vladar, who I mentioned has not been good for the past 2 years. So having a third goalie who is waiver exempt. I don't know if Wolf will be next season. I would imagine so, though. I think he's still pretty young. But having a third goalie who's waiver exempt, who you can send up and down, similar to a guy like Joseph Woll in Toronto now, who's sort of established himself as an NHL goalie. Pyotr Kochetkov is another guy I think about. There are a lot of good young third goalies who push the other two, and I think Wolf could be that next season for the Calgary Flames. And also, too, Jacob Peltier, in his limited time with the Flames this year, has played pretty well. And I just go back to that Sutter quote in the first game that he played, where they asked him, what did you think of Peltier tonight? And Sutter goes, what number was he? And then he reads his stats off of the game sheet. So I think that message from the coach is lost pretty quickly. And I think a coach like that, similar to Tortorella and some other guys around the league, might be beneficial to bring into a team who needs it right now to get over the hump, like a 1 year type thing, which is kind of what we saw Sutter do last year in Calgary. But I think the message has gone stale. I mean, obviously. Yeah. So coaching seems to be the other avenue where they can improve the most.
And going into next season as well, it's important to note with Calgary that they have a lot of guys on expiring contracts as well. So it'll be interesting to see what Calgary is like and how they're faring around the NHL trade deadline next year, because they could either be buyers or big-time sellers and potentially be kingmakers at next year's deadline if things don't go well and they've got all of those guys on expiring deals. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the Flames, but I agree with you. I think next year they'll be fine.